We're going to be talking about how do you buy a used Gibson Les Paul. Now in today's video, we're going to be focusing mostly on the Gibson Les Paul Standard, but this will cover the Classic and in most cases the Studio. We're going to include this free PDF, if you look down below, that will detail exactly what I'm looking at and some of the questions you should be asking yourself or the seller of this Gibson Les Paul. The first thing we're going to do is check to make sure the guitar is lacquer. Almost all the Gibson Les Pauls will be lacquer unless they have a satin or no finish whatsoever, but in almost every case you'll have a lacquer guitar. The fake guitars will not be lacquer, so that's the first thing you want to do to detect. There's two easy ways to detect if a guitar is lacquer. First, get a black light. This will help you detect because it will glow. This is also a great way to see if the guitar has been refinished in any way. If they've done any repairs, you'll see that those spots won't glow. Although this video isn't focusing on vintage Gibsons, vintage Gibson guitars will glow a bright lime green. Now here's a good contrast. Guitars made of polyurethane, polyester will not glow like nitrocellulose lacquer. And for fun, I thought I'd show you black lights are how we find scorpions where I live. Now if you don't have a black light or you're in a place that's really bright, there's actually a faster test. And that's essentially just to take a thumb or a finger and rub the side of the neck very quickly. Just get it to where your finger feels a little warm. You'll notice if it's really lacquer, before it even gets a little warm or even past the temperature of your body, it'll become very sticky. It'll feel almost like impossible to slide your thumb back and forth. You can do it on the body as well. Again, real quick, within seconds, as soon as you feel your thumb getting warm, you'll notice that it's really hard to get movement on the guitar. That's a quick, easy way to detect if it's lacquer. There's a third way, but I don't want you to rely on it, which is you can smell it, and in almost most cases, it'll smell sweet. First, we're going to start on the headstock, and we're going to look to make sure that there is no cracks or damage or broken headstock, a problem that you see on a lot of Gibson Les Pauls. There's a couple easy ways to detect this. First, you might see a hairline crack, even if it's been repaired. Sometimes that's as easy as just feeling it. In fact, feeling it sometimes is better than looking at it because you can detect a small little bump or indentation where it might have been repaired. But some repairs are really good. In fact, if you watch this video up here on our channel, you'll see a repair done on a broken headstock where you can't detect it's ever been repaired at all. So what do you do? Well, there's a couple things. First, you look for the tails. If the guitar has been painted or refinished. A guitar like this that doesn't have any black burst in it, all of a sudden you'll notice that there's a black burst here, and sometimes to hide their work, they'll burst it around the base of the neck too, just to kind of make it look like it was done that way. Now again, not one of these things is proof. It's just an accumulation of those things that kind of detect the problem. Another surefire thing to do when you're looking at a headstock to see if it's been cracked or repaired is go ahead and take off the truss rod cover. A lot of times if they replace this piece up top, or they've painted it or fixed it or hit it in any way, they didn't do the repair so well inside the truss rod cover. It's an easier area to detect a fine line crack. The next thing we want to look for is to make sure that the truss rod has a brass socket. In fact, all Gibson Les Pauls will have the same kind of Popeye looking wrench that I call it. It's a socket wrench. This socket wrench should fit into the truss rod. Not only should the guitar come with this wrench, but it should have that socket. The next thing you want to do is check the serial number, and that's a little tricky. In fact, we used to detect it by looking at how it's pressed in. You could tell the fake ones, but they've gotten better over time. And sometimes they actually paint them on the real Gibson, so it gets a little tricky if the import ones have been painted on as well. But if you're spending the kind of money on this kind of guitar, don't be afraid. You actually can call or go online and find resources to confirm that serial number. The other thing I want to alert you is if you buy a guitar used Gibson, whether it's coming from a retailer or an independent buyer, make sure that you get a receipt with the serial number on it. I understand that some sellers don't want to put the serial number on the photos of the auction or site you're buying it from, but if you're buying it, you should be able to get the serial number included with the invoice. And that's really important because especially if you're buying it from an independent seller or even a shady retailer, they might state that you swapped the guitar if there was no documentation of the actual serial number on the receipt. Once you feel pretty confident the headstock has not been repaired or it's not a fake, go ahead and go to the nut. The first thing you want to do is check to make sure that there's no visible gaps or cracks between the nut and where the nut joins the neck. I know Gibson gets a lot of heartache for kind of not having the best fit finish work, but believe it or not, you don't see very many examples of Gibson messing that up. So go ahead and look to make sure that the nut is sealed correctly, fit against, jointed, and perfectly against the neck and the binding. Don't worry if the nut and the binding do not match. It is very common for a Gibson guitar to have that not match. The next thing you want to notice about a Gibson Les Paul is that the slots in the nut are very shallow. Gibson does not create very deep slots in the nut. If you're seeing very deep cut slots in the nut where the string's set, it's not only a sign that the nut could be replaced with an aftermarket nut, or it could mean that somebody has done some repairs, and that might be a question why that was done. Like I said, in most cases, it should be a very shallow slot. Now we can go ahead and go to the neck inspection, and the first thing we want to do is look at the binding. If you're buying a standard or you're getting a classic or anything with binding, except for a certain year, the binding should come over the side of the fret. This is really important because not only do a lot of the fakes not have that, but a lot of times if a guitar has been refretted, in other words, they've ripped the frets out, a lot of the repair guys that do the refrets will go ahead and just kind of file those down to the base of the binding and then refret it and overlap the fret over the binding. Again, it's just a sign that shows that it happened. It's not horrible if it's been refretted, if it plays great and it looks great. Just understand it does change the value of the guitar somewhat. The next thing we want to look for is that we help detect whether or not the guitar is fake or it's been repaired, is looking at the inlays. And one of the things we want to look for is make sure the inlays are not cracked, damaged, or lifting out, or there's any spaces between the inlay and the wood, from which may show that the wood has either expanded or shrank. And another thing that's really interesting about the fakes is when they inlay, they kind of can't do the detail work or don't want to do the detail work at that price point. So you'll see a lot of black filler. So what you're looking for when you're looking at the inlay is a little kind of black. You'll see it looks like black paint kind of pushed into the gap between the inlay and the wood. Now we want to go ahead and inspect the base of the neck, where the neck joins the body. Just like we did with the headstock, we're making sure that there's no cracks, gaps, or anything that there is showing any signs of abuse or damage. You should not see a scarf joint right here at the base of the neck, and you should not see a piece of wood glued at the base of where the neck meets the body. So again, these are also very quick tells to see that somehow this is wrong or it's been repaired. Now, once we've done that, we can go ahead and start inspecting the frets. We want to make sure the frets don't have any divots or dents or dead spots because that's going to imply that we're going to need fret work, especially if you're buying a used one. It's not going to be inexpensive. So this is a thing that if you're doing that, make sure that the price is accounting for that. A good fret level could be kind of pricey, and definitely a refret even more so. I put a space on the sheet where you can mark down all the frets that you are either finding that are too high or too damaged, too rough, so you can make an assessment of whether or not the guitar is going to need extensive repair. So now let's go ahead and make sure the neck is not twisted. What we're going to do is we're going to sight this. So what we're looking at is we're looking down the neck, as you can see right here, and we're going to make sure that there's no overbow or underbow. That's not something that we're too concerned with because that could be adjusted in a setup, but definitely want to make sure there's not a twist. A twist will make sure is as you sight down the low E string, using that as your line of sight, and your high E string as a straight line, you want to make sure the neck is following that line all the way down. Now, after you've done all that assessment, go ahead and assess if you feel, or if whoever you brought with you feels, the guitar needs a setup. If it does, don't be afraid to ask if they can discount that cost out of the guitar. In other words, hey, you know, it's going to need a setup. I checked around, this is what it costs to do that. Is there any way I can kind of get that included in the price or get that discounted so I can have it done? It's not a hard ask to do. It's not unreasonable to ask. So now let's look at the body. Let's make sure that the binding doesn't have any cracks or issues. Don't be afraid when you're rubbing the side of the binding. Again, use your hand to kind of detect issues. If you feel a little bump, like sometimes like the binding is not lining up with the body, that isn't a tell that it's defective. Believe it or not, that's one of the issues that people talk about with the details about Gibson. It's Gibson, sometimes like this one, I can feel a little bit of misalignment right there. It's not the end of the world. It's actually pretty common on a Les Paul to feel that. And so I don't use that as necessarily like here it is right here. It's a little off right there. Not the end of the world. Now we want to go ahead, and since we're looking at it, look for visual cracks in the body or damage. We also want to make sure that the guitar is at least 2 pieces of wood to 1 piece of wood. In most cases, it's going to be 2 pieces of wood. Gibson would not have a 5-piece, so if you see a lot of pieces of wood, then that's a sign that you have an issue. This guitar is 2 pieces of wood. I can see the seam down the center perfectly. Let me know this is 2 different pieces of mahogany. That's okay for a Gibson Les Paul, but like I said, if you see a seam here or a seam here, again, you have another flag that you might have either a counterfeit or if there's something wrong.
Another thing you can do is remove one of the pickups. Repair guys like me will always mark inside the guitar that they've repaired something so somebody knows when they're inspecting the guitar. This is also a great way to figure out if the Gibson is real because it'll have a maple cap. If you look to your right, you'll see the dark chocolatey mahogany and then the vanilla maple on top. If it was a made in China or import or fake guitar, sometimes it will have that, but then a thin veneer, and sometimes all-way mahogany and just a paper thin piece of maple. This is also a great time to check the pickups. Make sure they're Gibson pickups and they're the correct models that go with this guitar. That's something you can check with the specifications of the guitar. If they have been changed, you'll at least know about it or what's been going on with it.
Now keep in mind, these are general rules, and just because any of these things are not right, it's not definitive proof that this is fake or it's an issue. It just means you're gonna have to do, that's a signal to do more research, because there's so many models over the years. There's no way one video can cover every single Gibson model over the years. This is general guidelines that will get you pretty safe. The next thing we want to check is the three-way switch. Now I know that's part of the electronics, but since we're looking at the body, I always look at the switch around that time. What we're going to do is obviously make sure it throws okay and it's nice. The other thing you want to notice is you don't see any threading. In other words, the Gibson switch will not show any of the threading that you see on a lot of the import guitars. The other thing you can do is take off the switch tip, believe it or not, and look, and a lot of the import guitars will have a switch tip hole that's really small. Now we want to make sure it's not missing any screws and that the screws are not damaged. Now one of the things I like to do is take my finger and rub over all the screws on the guitar, and I'm feeling for barbs. It's a tell that somebody has been taking things apart, and so you really want to check their work. So especially if they're not using the right screwdrivers. So again, this feels fine. Now we want to check to make sure that there's no cracked pickup rings. This is really common with Gibsons. There's usually a crack down the center, or there's cracks on the side from somebody kind of cranking down the screw too tight. Now we're going to talk about the electronics. The electronics are super easy. The first thing we want to do is just simply turn them and make sure that they feel right. A Gibson guitar, all of them will feel nice and quality when you turn them, even if they're using push-pull pots. They will not be using excessively inexpensive potentiometers. Now when you look inside, you want to make sure that the potentiometers you see are larger, not the smaller kind of cheap ones that you see in the Chinese imports, especially the inexpensive imports. If they're push-pull potentiometers, it gets a little tricky because there's not really a whole lot of quality levels on those. And also, like I said, because sometimes used stuff gets modified, if it has push-pulls like this, it has 4 of them, make sure they do exactly what the manufacturer specifies on the manual or the website that the guitar should do. If it has been modified, be aware of that, because again, those are signs that you might have to fix something down the road. So if you do all those things, I think you're going to find that you're going to have a pretty good guitar. It at least helps you understand what you're looking at, and it definitely keeps you in line, especially sometimes if you're looking at a good deal or a guitar and you're thinking, okay, I don't want to lose the opportunity on this. A sheet like this sometimes will help you, like a good friend, kind of keep your emotional state at bay, you know, and just go through and be logical about it. The last thing you want to check is the case. The other thing you want to make sure is it has its manual and paperwork. Again, it helps the value of the guitar to have the case candy, but more importantly, if it's fake, it's a lot trickier. They do sometimes throw in this kind of paperwork with the fakes, so this is, again, not a sign that it is real if it has the paperwork. Make sure it does have the truss rod adjustment tool. If you're buying any of the newer Gibsons in the last few years, keep in mind that it should have a picture of it in the factory being plecked. So you should have an actual picture of your Gibson Les Paul with the guitar in the case. And as always, until next time, know your gear.